We're especially happy to have joining us Eliad Eliyahu Ben Shushan, who is the Atlanta and St. Louis Federation's representative in Israel, the Partnership Director of Yokneam and Megiddo, Atlanta and St. Louis. Eliad, thank you so much for being here. And David Kaplan is the presenter today. David is also joining us from Israel. We thank him for doing this at such a late time for him and for everyone else from Israel who's joining in. David was a partner in a law firm in South Africa before he made Aliyah in 1986, where today he is a freelance journalist and the editor of a number of English-speaking magazines, notably the Hilton Israel magazine, the Inbal magazine, and for 20 years he was also the editor of the Telfed magazine, which is distributed to the entire South African community in Israel, as well as a readership abroad. His articles have appeared in the Jerusalem Post, Haaretz, and overseas Jewish publications. He's a co-founder and editor today of Lay of the Land, a multimedia platform with articles and news broadcasts from Israel 5 days a week. David is a former chairman of the South African Zionist Federation in Israel, Telfed, and is the chairman and co-founder of TBT, Truth Be Told, an Israeli-based group committed to disseminating accurate reportage on Israel and responding to biased and malicious reporting in Israel in the foreign media. He's a co-founder and the chairman of the Isaac Ochberg Committee in Israel. He helped organize the Ochberg reunion of Megiddo in 2011, and when the Isaac Ochberg Park was officially inaugurated in that city, and the event was attended by surviving families of Isaac Ochberg's and descendants of the orphans. In 2021, he and the Ochberg Committee, together with the Megiddo Regional Council, helped to organize the Ochberg Centenary webinar that included panelists from all over the world. He is committed to perpetuating the legacy of Isaac Ochberg, and we welcome him today to thank him for coming to share the story of Isaac Ochberg. David, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Can I begin? Right. It's really wonderful to be addressing you today. For me, a completely new audience. You guys in the US Midwest, me in central Israel, about 10 miles north of Tel Aviv, and about, I suppose, you guys did in miles, so about 40, 50 miles south of the area we're going to be talking about tonight, or tonight, which is Megiddo, of which we all have a shared interest. We converge on a terrain which in the New Testament sees as the place of Armageddon. In the book of Revelations, it talks about the battle of the end of days. As Jews, we see it very differently. We see it as the beginning of days, because with Megiddo, there's so much connection with the birth of Zionism and the rebirth of the state of Israel, in which the name Ochberg is such an integral part of. I'm going to talk about today of a story that began 100 years ago. As you heard, it's our centennial. It starts in Eastern Europe, in an area mostly known in pre-Russian Revolution times as the Pale of Settlement, that area where Jews were entitled to live from the Baltic to the Black Sea. It runs through South Africa, and it concludes here in Eretz Israel, in Megiddo. I want to stress right at the beginning that, because you guys are in St. Louis, that this story is a universal story. It's a universal saga, and it has a universal message. And that message is written here on my T-shirt, which I'm going to hold up. It was you can see the portrait of Isaac Ochberg. It was the T-shirt that we had for the 90th anniversary when we launched the Ochberg Park in Megiddo in 2001. And it's a quote from the Talmud. It says, "He that saves one life, it's as if he has saved the entire world." Because that's in part what today's story is all about. If it wasn't for Isaac Ochberg, there are thousands of people all over the world that would not be alive today. They were children that were saved. But there's another message that I want to stress before we continue. And let me explain it this way. I attended last month a webinar on Lockdown University. Let me just, before I begin, and like I normally start in real life, not on webinars, I usually ask the people whether they've ever heard of Isaac Ochberg. And I'm just wondering over here, forget about, if you hadn't received tonight's invitation or today's invitation, maybe by a show of hands, can you indicate, had you heard of Isaac Ochberg? No, I don't. Very few. So let me answer as follows. I was saying that last month on Lockdown University, I attended a webinar where the person interviewed was the son of Elisha Wiesel. And he was asked the tough question, do you think there could ever be another Shoah, a Holocaust of the Jewish people? It's a difficult question. And he answered off the bat right away. And he said, no, never. And then he explained. And he didn't explain and say, well, the world has changed. The world has become more tolerant, more understanding. There are now protective institutions in play. He said, no, never. And the reason, because there is a state of Israel. Not only a state of Israel, but a strong state of Israel. And so that makes a lot of the difference, because we Jews around the world can walk tall, they can feel secure with the knowledge that there is in Israel. And we can think in your neck of the woods, what happened in 1939 when the St. Louis came with 900 passengers, all trying to flee the Nazis, and they were refused entry, denied entry in Cuba, then the USA, and then Canada. And you remember the famous lines from the Canadian official about letting Jews in? None is too much. Okay. So, and you know, they went back to Europe and what befell them. So my question and point that I'm trying to say over here, that before there was an Israel, and when Jews were in difficulty, what they needed was an Isaac Ochberg. And very thankfully, in 1921, what was happening in Eastern Europe, there was such a man as Isaac Ochberg. So over to you, Judith, if you can just now show the first video clip.
By 1920, more than 10 million people in Russia had perished from 6 years of war, famine, and disease. 1 million children were without mothers or fathers. But one group of these orphans, numbering as many as 300,000, were especially at risk. For they were Jews. This is the story of how a businessman at the other end of the world turned his belief that something must be done for these children into action. As a 17-year-old immigrant from Russia, he'd arrived in Cape Town in 1895, penniless and unable to speak English. Within 10 years, he was a successful entrepreneur, and by 1920, his business interests, which stretched from ship salvage to property development and cinema ownership, made him one of South Africa's wealthiest men. This was Isaac Ochberg.
He was an exceptional person who was willing to take risks and willing to put himself at risk when he believed in something.
And it absolutely pained him that there were people, that there were still pogroms, and it just broke his heart.
He had the resources both financially but also as a person.
He became head of the Cape Jewish Orphanage. And it was then, round about 1920, when he heard about the plight of the homeless Jewish orphans in and around Eastern Europe.
And he couldn't see any way that he could not go and save children if he could.
And the orphans very much had a relationship with him. There was no doubt, you know, they would sit on his lap and call him Daddy and so on.
We called him Daddy because to most of our children, he was the only Daddy they ever knew.
We ran to him, Daddy Ochberg, Daddy Ochberg.
It took him 3 hours to walk up the stairs. One child would pull at his little finger, the other one would pull at the jacket, the other one would pull at his trousers. He just couldn't move.
He was a larger-than-life character.
To bring our children, put himself into danger. He was much more than just an ordinary man.
He gave off an aura, you know, of goodwill. Unbelievable.
He not only saved me, but he saved all these children. Now, to save so many lives, he is an extraordinary man.
Right. You saw their snippets of the movie that was made in 2005. It was released in 2008. And it's really an important movie because our knowledge of history is often lazily shaped by movies, particularly Oscar-winning movies. I mean, just think about how many people have hyped their understanding of what Jewish life under the Romans was like by seeing Ben-Hur with Charlton Heston, or their understanding of the birth of modern Israel by watching in the 1960s Exodus with Paul Newman and Eva Maria Saint. Both those movies won big time at the Oscars. And I would say little or less would have been known about South Africa's finest communal leader, a hero and a Zionist, had this documentary not been made by the director John Blair, who had previously, by the way, won an Oscar for his movie on Anna Frank in 1995. This movie was also submitted for an Oscar. It did very well, came close, made the last tier selection. And I remember writing at the time in one of my articles, he may not have won a second Oscar, although he came close, but he won big in the sense that it reawakened a chapter of history that had been forgotten, neglected, and or suppressed. Which brings me to how I come as someone not connected with the story to being so passionately involved with the Isaac Ochberg Heritage Foundation. And my genesis of Ochberg was at the turn of the millennium in the year 2000. I was newly elected chairman of the South African Zionist Federation known as Telford in Israel. When a woman barged into the office from Netanya, she was a woman then well in her 80s, and she said, I want to see the chairman. In fact, she demanded to see the chairman. I went to the reception area, met the woman, Mrs. Michalowski from Netanya, and she said, take me to your boardroom. I said, why? She says, I'll explain on the way. So we marched down the passage to the boardroom, and she said, I want to see if there is a portrait of Isaac Ochberg in the boardroom. I didn't know who Isaac Ochberg was. And I knew that the boardroom contained quite a lot of portraits in black and white of the usual suspects of all the usual Zionists connected with Israel and with Telford. Anyway, we got into the boardroom, and there on the wall was a portrait of Isaac Ochberg. And I said, so explain. And she said, In 1948, when the State of Israel was established, there was a deal between the family and the South African Zionist Federation that there would always be a portrait of Isaac Ochberg in perpetuity in the boardroom to commemorate this great man, this great communal leader, this great Zionist, and this great hero. So that piqued my interest. And then a few years later, I saw an insertion in the Jerusalem Post that said that there's a production company that are going to make a movie on Isaac Ochberg, and they're looking for Isaac Ochberg orphans, and if we could help in that regard. I phoned up Sam Levin, who came to Israel in 1951, who knew everybody of the South African community. I asked him, do you think there are any Isaac Ochberg orphans alive living in Israel? And he said, David, do the math. It's highly unlikely. After all, this took place in 1921. We're now talking about 2000, and now it's about 4 or 5. Unlikely. But he did say that when I was a child in 1921, my parents volunteered at the orphanage in Cape Town, and I was friendly with an Ochberg orphan. And he told me the story of his friend who had one arm, Harry Stillerman. And he said the story with Harry was, he was in a shtetl with his parents. The Cossacks came in, it was a pogrom. They killed his parents right in front of him. And little Harry lay there in the mud, and they were about to finish Harry off when Harry raised up his arm, and the Cossack on horseback came along and just took off his left arm at the elbow and left him there to die. But he didn't die, because along the way came Isaac Ochberg, picked up Harry and brought him to South Africa. And he's one of the 187 out of the 200 that eventually made his way to South Africa, and whose plaque is in the Hill of Names at Megiddo. Anyway, I wrote an article a day or two later and then forgot about it. And a week later, I get a phone call and says, from a woman who says, I've just read your article in the Jerusalem Post, and my name is Sissy Harris. I'm 88 years old. I live in Haifa, and I'm an Ochberg orphan. So we had found our Ochberg orphan. I immediately got in touch with the production company in London. Within 2 months, Sissy Harris was flown out and joined the production team, and they flew out to Eastern Europe, where they filmed the movie, parts of which you just saw now. And there were some really sad moments where you see Sissy. Sissy died at the age of 102 about 2 years ago in Modi'in in Israel. She was the last surviving Ochberg orphan. And you see her walking in the town of Kospelon, which was one of the places where Ochberg went to retreat to pick up the orphans. And she walks over the stretch of grass which had once been a Jewish cemetery. And as she's walking over it, she remarks, somewhere beneath my feet lie my parents buried. And very sadly, because she left at the age of between 2 and 3, she has no photographs of her parents. And she was asked, do you know what your parents even looked like? And she says, no, not a clue. She has no knowledge of what her parents looked like, having left at the age of 2 and having no photographs. So going back to 1921, what was the situation? You saw briefly in the video clip you saw, Europe, in Eastern Europe, was being devastated. You had the battle going on between the Reds and the White Russians, and there were pogroms. And in the midst of all this, there were the Jews that were suffering. And I think between 1919 and 1921, there were 1,600 pogroms. No one will ever know the numbers that that were actually killed, but they say that between 100 to 150,000 Jews were killed during this time. Another 50,000 Jewish women were raped, and 1 million Jews were directly affected by the pogroms. While all civilians were affected and were at risk, it was only the Jews who were killed simply because they were Jews. And to give you an idea of what was going on, I'm just going to give you some quotes of some of the people, of the orphans who were interviewed in the movie. Manuel Romanovsky. Our house was opposite a Russian military barracks. We had a cow, we had milk, we had cheese. Father was a shoemaker. He was quite a peaceful fellow. He never hurt anybody. It all started on a Friday night. We were playing in the open ground, a sandy patch. One of the officers caught hold of one of the little boys. We were about 5, 6 years of age. A soldier grabbed him by the neck, took out his sword, showing us how he was going to cut off his head. I remember it. Then he starts crying and he says, and the mother saw it, more tears, and ends off by saying, she was never the same again. And then talking about his own father, he goes on to say, I heard they shot my father. He was hiding on the top of a shul. They took him into the barracks and shot him on the spot. There was no argument. They buried him in a shallow grave. Earlier this year, I was in touch with his son who lives in Canada, in Edmonton, Canada, and the Romanovsky family have sponsored at the Ochberg Park in Megiddo a certain section for their family, remembering Ochberg and his father. And he provided some more information. And he said to extract information from his dad before he passed away was a 5-year road of discovery. Why? We asked my dad to tell us his story. He was adamant. You should only know good things. It's a dark story. I only want you to be happy. So I'm not going to tell it to you. In the end, stories started coming out. And he continues. I told you how they shot his father. Then to save her children, his mother told her 3 children, Chaya, Feifel, and my dad, who was 6 years old, to leave the shtetl for fear of the Cossacks returning to finish off their uncompleted job by killing the rest of the Jews. My dad separated from his older siblings, eventually arriving in Moldova, Poland, after a long and dangerous journey. Even more dangerous is that he was only 6 years old at the time. He then became a street child for almost a year, surviving due to the grace of Hashem until this marvelous man, Isaac Ochberg, found him and took him to South Africa, where he was adopted by the Romanovsky family. He lived a full life in Cape Town, marrying, having a successful business career, having 4 boys and 5 grandchildren, all thanks to Isaac Ochberg. Judith, can you just put the photograph of the 2 Ochberg orphans there, the one with the tree? Not that, yes, that one. Okay, so on the left, we have Solly Jossel. Solly Jossel passed away quite a few years ago, but that is on the occasion of his 100th birthday. So he had a good full life. And that's him with his wife. Solly was interviewed and he said, before I was born, my father was in the Polish army and he came to visit my mother over a weekend. And while they were sitting, they heard a noise outside and went out to look and saw an elderly woman being attacked by the Cossacks, and he went to try and help her. They shot him. While he was lying there, my mother went out to see what was happening, found him dying. She was then about 6 months pregnant with me, and he died in her arms, and that was the end of him. Now, you can imagine how I felt in 2016. I'm in Johannesburg giving a talk on Isaac Ochberg at the Jewish Day School, King David School. And like I did now, ask the question of the audience over there: has anybody ever heard of Isaac Ochberg? Now, I always start that question. One hand goes up. He stands up. He says, my great-grandfather was saved by Isaac Ochberg. I asked, who are you? And he said, I'm the great-grandson of Solly Gossel. That's the man you see there in the photograph. He's also the great-great-grandson of the man who was shot outside his home. Now, the woman on the right is Sissy Harris. She is the woman that I told you about when I wrote the article in the Jerusalem Post, who then a few days later said, I read your article. I'm an Isaac Ochberg. She at the time was living in Haifa. She was the last surviving Ochberg orphan. She died 2 years ago at the age of 102 in Modain. Here at the occasion when we launched the park, you can see she's about to plant a tree in Megiddo at the Ochberg Park, and she's being helped on the right-hand side by Benny Penzik, who is the founding member of our foundation, the Isaac Ochberg Heritage Foundation. He has the rare distinction of both his parents being Ochberg orphans, and the other fellow on the left with the spade is Mesh Isaacson, who at the time was chairman of Telford. And just to show how sprightly she was, she got annoyed with both of them and told her to leave her alone. She said, just because I'm 88 doesn't mean to say I can't plant a tree. And she went ahead and planted the tree. Very sprightly lady. She lived up to 102. The situation at the time, with the situation that was going on, letters were smuggled out of Eastern Europe, and one letter found its way to Cape Town. And this is what galvanized the Jewish community under the leadership of Isaac Ochberg to do something to help and try save the Jewish orphans. You can take the photographs away now, Judith. And here I'm going to turn to the daughter of Isaac Ochberg, who describes exactly what was going on at the time in 1921, about her father and about his thinking. Because I think it's also important to understand the psychology, not only who did what, but why they did it. What made Isaac Ochberg take on this incredible task? Some might say absolutely insane when you think of it, in 1921, to mount an operation and go by yourself to the most dangerous part in the world, and particularly for Jews, to really risk life and limb. And she writes over here, Bertha Epstein, who's the daughter, when the stories infiltrated into South Africa, my father was torn with the agony of his luckless Jewish brethren, and he yearned with every fiber of his being to find some means of helping them. He was fully determined that there must be something constructive he could do to alleviate the misery. To this end, he made up his mind that come what may, he would somehow or other get to the Ukraine. Under prevailing conditions, this was an extremely hazardous idea, but risky as it was, he planned very carefully against possible failure. His first thought and concern was for the hundreds of destitute and abandoned parentless children who were known to be wandering in that area, even hiding in the forest and foraging in every conceivable place for anything they could find. And you've heard some of the stories I was relating. He therefore approached the Union government for permission. Now, he met at the time who was the South African Prime Minister, Jan Smuts. And they came to an arrangement, they came to a deal. And the deal was that Jan Smuts agreed to 200 orphans, okay, with the following condition. They had to be physically and mentally wholesome, intact. They had to be complete orphans, in other words, no parent alive. and they had to be under the age of 16. Isaac Ochberg agreed entirely to all three conditions, shook on it, and disobeyed all three. And this is apparent because, as you know, and I spoke to you about Harry Stidleman, who came with one hand, with one arm shorn off at the elbow. He wasn't fully intact. And Sissy Harris came with her two sisters. One of them was over 16. And how did Isaac Ochberg maneuver over there? He turned the elder sister into a nurse, and he said he required nurses to come along for the children on the long journey back, and that's how he got by over there. She goes on writing about her father. One of the other concessions was that the Jewish community of South Africa had to take complete responsibility for the orphans, complete moral and financial responsibility. And this meant that Isaac Ochberg had to fundraise in South Africa. And for a lot of you over here who are involved in fundraising for Israel, it's interesting to hear a passage like this dealing with fundraising in 1921. What did he do? He went all over the country to every town and village, no matter how remote, to gain the support financially. It involved traveling by train, by car, or any other available transport, any place where there were Jewish people. He made impassioned appeals from public platforms, private, begging every Jew and Jewess to come forward to help with whatever in the form of money, clothing, food, etc. But most important of all, he pleaded for others of adoption of the individual children into private homes where they would be able to receive loving care. Fundraising efforts of every possible kind were organized by all sections of the Jewish community of South Africa, from Cape Town to Southwest Africa, which today is known as Namibia. My father had himself photographed with children at the Jewish orphanage. It was made into a postcard and sent to every member of every congregation all over South Africa. The message on it took the form of an appeal which read as follows: with the compliments of the President of the Committee of the Cape Jewish Orphanage. So there you can see how this one man galvanized the Jewish community of South Africa for a particular cause. And you can imagine that not everybody at the time would have supported it. After all, if there are 300,000 Jewish orphans in Eastern Europe, why go to such effort to save only 200? There's a certain thread of logic to that. And yet, Ochberg won the day. So compelling was his argument. And it's the message over here that I showed you in the beginning of my T-shirt. To save the life of one is if you save the entire world. And the other question it kind of raises, you're all familiar the way philanthropy works today. It's perfectly understandable and it's perfectly normal. The very wealthy give the money because they can afford it. They then set up organizations or they give to organizations, and others do the actual work, whatever that may entail. But here you had one of South Africa's richest Jews, not saying, I'm going to give the money or get the money. He is going to go himself and save these Jewish orphans. He's going to put his own life and risk his own life to go into the most dangerous part in the world to help save these Jews. And that's what he did. And I'm now going to read from you again, Bertha Epstein recording how Ochberg went to London, then set up the headquarters in Warsaw, where he set up his headquarters, and then, like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, he would then crisscross again all over this dangerous area. Remember, there's no infrastructure, so he went by truck, by train, by horse and carriage, going from one shtetl town to another, one orphanage, picking up these orphans. She writes and describes it as follows. This is now During the whole of June and July 1921, he moved from one devastating village to another, traveling by wagon or truck or any other means of transport which he could hire or commandeer. In this way, he picked up the children wherever they were to be found, in their ones and twos and threes or more when possible. And he took them to special depots where he had people waiting to care for the children, whom he had specially engaged for this purpose. Most of the children were in a shocking state. They were starving, clad in rags and verminous. Many of them were ill from the trauma of the horrible, tremendous experiences which they had had. And many were still in a state of shock from seeing their parents murdered before their eyes or having to watch their mothers and sisters being raped. Apart from all these horrors, typhus, cholera, and smallpox were rampant. And my father himself had to take every possible precaution to protect himself. In his life was in danger all the time. Or if anything happened to him, the whole project would have been abandoned. So you can see how dangerous it is. He collected 200, and for a variety of reasons, some of the kids ran away. Some of the kids were afraid of stories about Africa and lions and tigers and so on. He ended up with 187 in Danzig, where they boarded the ship, bound for Southampton. They spent a few weeks in London where there were celebrities, they were in the newspapers, and then they took the boat to Edinburgh Castle to Cape Town. And at Cape Town, they were divided between Cape Town and Johannesburg. Half of them were taken to the orphanage in Cape Town, the other half to the orphanage in Johannesburg, and some of them over the years were adopted. As you saw, the Romanowski was adopted by the Romanowski family. I'm going to stop here, Judith, because let's move to the second part. And if you can show, maybe before you show the second video clip, maybe just show the photographs of the Ochberg orphans in a group, and you'll see that they all got numbers on them. And why? Because it was so difficult and so complicated with the names and everything, that to make it easier, they were given numbers. There you can see on their tops, they all had numbers. It gives you an idea. All right, Judith, if you can now move on to the second video clip.
In 1922, Isaac Ochberg again left for Europe to save orphans. But by now the political climate had changed. The best Ochberg could do was arrange to fund an orphanage in Odessa. In the years that followed, he accumulated even greater wealth for himself. But in 1933, tragedy struck. The surrogate father of nearly 200 Russian children had had 6 children of his own. 2 died in infancy. 2 others, Lily and Harry, were born with learning difficulties, but his beloved youngest daughter was Ruth. On April the 4th, 1933, the day after this photo was taken, she collapsed and died from an undiagnosed heart disorder, aged just 15. At her grave, her distraught father cried out, "Oh God, don't take my child." From the moment of Ruth's death, his health began to suffer, and 4 years later, while returning from Europe to South Africa, he died at sea from cancer. Today, his grave remains largely forgotten in Cape Town's Jewish cemetery.
Isaac Ochberg had 2 great passions, Zionism and the orphan children that he rescued.
Yitzhak Ochberg was a member of the Zionist Congress, which convened in Switzerland in 1929. So I believe that it was the founding stones of Yitzhak Ochberg with his commitment to saving Jews, which drives us today in our commitment to save Jews.
It is a matter of record that Isaac Ochberg's bequest in 1937 stands as the largest personal donation ever made to the JNF. The record, $500,000 US, stands to this very day.
That bequest that was left by Ochberg in 1937 was used to buy land in the north, which today houses Kibbutzim Gal Ed and Kibbutz Dalia, both of which are today still thriving kibbutzim. And in fact, in July 2011, in order to celebrate the 90th anniversary of Ochberg's rescue mission, we had a 2-day gathering of all the descendants and of as many orphans as possible on Kibbutz Dalia.
In recognition, the JNF has created not only a memorial to this man, returning the magnificent stone monument to its rightful place, but also to the orphans Ochberg so heroically saved. On the Hill of Names, you may see a plaque for each of those orphans. And today, in 2011, these names may now be enshrined for all eternity.
I think to see my Omar's name immortalised in this monument forever is really moving, and it brings it home what she went through, because I was only young when she died.
May all of us be blessed with the great spirit of Yitzhak Ochberg, and may we continue to fulfill his dream and his legacy for the well-being of the Jewish people and the state of Israel.
It is a demonstrable fact which history has confirmed, that whoever has linked his name with the land of Israel has tread the road to immortality.
For it is written, "Then will I remember my covenant with Jacob, and also my covenant with Isaac, and also my covenant with Abraham will I remember. And I will remember the land."
Right. So now we're going to deal with Isaac Ochberg's Zionism, because that to me is as important as everything else. And to understand how did he become such a great Zionist? Actually, quite interesting. You saw Isaac Herzog, the two Isaacs, Isaac Ochberg and now Isaac Herzog, being interviewed recently for the centennial. Then he was chairman of the Sochnut of the Jewish Agency. Today, he's now the incoming president of the state of Israel. So things can move, things can change, and for the better, which is fantastic. But one of the points that Isaac Herzog made, which connects with Isaac Ochberg, is that the World Zionist Congress of 1929, I'm not sure if it was held in Basel, but in 1929, Congress of the World Zionist Organization, it was at that Congress where the Jewish Agency was established. And you remember Ben Gurion became its first chairman. And who attended from South Africa that particular Congress? None other than Isaac Ochberg. So Isaac Ochberg is just so integrally involved in the establishment of the Jewish state. And the question is why? How did it come about? And again, I turn to the writings of his daughter, Bertha Epstein. Because in 1926, Isaac Ochberg and his wife, Polly, visited Palestine. And she writes, with Isaac's relief work and the relief work we're talking about, the orphans now behind him, his thoughts inevitably turned to Eretz Israel. And in 1926, he and my mother visited what was then Palestine. To a Zionist of the caliber of my father, this was much more than a sentimental journey. In an interview with the Zionist Record, which was the South African newspaper, Zionist newspaper at the time, Isaac Ochberg said the following, quote, I came away with a feeling of confidence that the Jewish problem can and will be solved ultimately in Eretz Israel and in Eretz Israel only. Then went on to say, as a commercial man, I could not help but be genuinely impressed by the fine progress of industrial development in so young a country. There is every prospect of most important industrial development in Palestine as the country grows, end quote. These are prophetic words indeed. He then goes on to talk about how he and Polly, his wife, heard the great violinist Yasha Heifetz, which I'm sure some of you will remember or heard of, play before what she describes as 6,000 chalutzim. It was an open-air concert. The performance took place in the open air, and Ochberg remarked, again, I quote, I traveled 6 hours by car to be present at this concert, but I would gladly have traveled any distance for such a pleasure. To hear a renowned Jewish genius play in a Jewish land before Jewish agriculturalists was one of our greatest experiences, end quote. Interestingly enough, this concert took place in a stone quarry in Kibbutz Ein Harod, which is at the base of Har Gilboa, Mount Gilboa, which is at the eastern end of the Jezreel Valley, which is not very far from Megiddo. He then went on and he urged all South Africans to spend their holidays in Palestine. And you can imagine in 1926, who in South Africa ever went on holidays, never mind holidays abroad, but that's what he said. And he said, quote, even outside of political and national reasons, it is well worthwhile. The glorious scenery, the fine climate, and its many historic places make a visit to this land a most enjoyable and certainly an unforgettable experience. He could be writing a tourist brochure about Israel. And she goes on to say that both my parents were greatly impressed by the work being done on the land, and they were deeply moved by the new University of Jerusalem that was taking shape on Mount Scopus. You remember the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, although founded in 1918, was actually officially opened in 1925, and that was a year before Isaac Ochberg visited Palestine in 1926, the year later. And he was one of the first people to give a major donation, and it was towards the Department of Agriculture, which he saw as the prime area which Chalutzim, the pioneers, should be exerting their efforts in the new state, in a future state of Israel. And she goes on to say that it was doubtless that from this visit that began to take shape his idea on Zionism, which had a huge impact on Zionism in South Africa. And he goes on to say that just to show how committed he was already as a Zionist, he named one of his commercial blocks Balfour House after the Balfour Declaration, and then established the Isaac Ochberg Palestine Fund, and which reads, the primary object of this fund is to assist the settlement of poor Jewish men and women on the land in Palestine. And he adds a further clause that the Jewish National Fund shall, as soon as possible, purchase and transfer of the whole of this bequest, a tract of land suitable for agricultural settlement by the Jews. And this is the land, and you saw in the movie clip now, that was used, apart from education, sponsoring the University of the Hebrew University, to buy the tracts of land which are today Kibbutz Talia, Kibbutz Gal Ed in Megiddo. And what's fascinating that although Isaac Ochberg died in 1936, if we look how his legacy continues, if in 1921, Isaac Ochberg was saving children, orphans, 20 years later, through his funds, he is now saving future generations. In Kibbutz Talia is established in 1939, and another 10 years later, when Kibbutz Gal Ed is established, when Holocaust survivors from Europe came across and joined the kibbutz. So the legacy of salvation of Jews continues long after Isaac Ochberg passes on. And this is incredible about his legacy. And what is fascinating is that he foresaw the need. I mean, after all, in the 1920s, who could foresee Hitler or what would befall the Jewish community? But he knew from what was befalling Eastern Europe, what was then going on with the pogroms and Jews being killed and massacred and raped, that there was a need to save Jews, and he was already planning ahead for money to set aside to buy tracts of land for future Jews in need. He foresaw this. How much time have I still got, Stephen?
About 10 minutes.
Okay. Our job now is really to carry on with the legacy, and we've been very active in recent years. We've been addressing schools in Hebrew in Israel. We've been addressing schools in South Africa. In 2016, I addressed the Limud conference in Johannesburg, addressed the schools in all the Jewish day schools in Johannesburg. 2 years ago, we held a essay competition here at the school in Ramat Sharon, where school kids were asked to write essays on Isaac Ochberg. They could do it in the form of poetry, they could compose a will, they could write prose about Isaac Ochberg. And in this way, we want to carry on the legacy of Isaac Ochberg. It's important because what is the takeaway message that resonates for all time? That one good deed today, you never know down the line what impact it's going to have. And that is the case for what Isaac Ochberg did in 1921. Today, there must be over 4,000 descendants of Ochberg orphans all over the world. And many of whom we met when we had the reunion at 2011, when we opened up the park and had the event at Kibbutz Dalia. And it was a very moving experience where people from all over the world, Ochberg orphan descendants, descended on Kibbutz Dalia. And we began the event when we gathered there on the lawn. I was the MC at the time, and I invited people to come to the floor, to the microphone, and speak about their parents, to kind of like relate whatever they wanted to relate about their parents. I never thought that there would be any great enthusiasm because people were very reticent to even talk about it. Like the Holocaust, many survivors are reluctant to speak about it. And we assume that not many of the descendants of orphans would like to speak about it in the same way as Romanowski said about his father, said, it's a dark period, I'd rather not talk about it. So when I opened up at the microphone and I said, is there anybody who would like to speak? No hands went up. And then all of a sudden, a hand went up and the person came up and started speaking and was joined by members of his family and told the most amazing story. And then one after another, what I thought would maybe last for 10 minutes, 2 hours later, as people came to the microphone, it was a cathartic exercise and related one story after another. And I remember, there are so many stories. The last story was very telling. It was from a fellow called, from Melbourne, Nathan, I forget his surname, but anyway, he and his wife were living in Melbourne, and he gets up to the microphone and he says, I am meant to be in Singapore. I didn't know about Isaac Ochberg. And he starts telling the story that a week before he was having a shower. They had booked tickets to go on holiday to Singapore. He knew that he had been adopted, lived in Johannesburg, and then emigrated to Australia, to Melbourne. And his wife screams from him from the lounge. She says, Arnold's his name. Arnold, come here. Arnold comes to the lounge, and there on the table there in the lounge is a newspaper with a photograph of all these kids. She says to him, and they're all young, and she says to him, look at that kid, they're 2-3 years old. It looks exactly how you would have looked when you were 2-3 years old. And he looks at the picture and he says, yes. And he phones up and he does some quick research, phones up David Sandler, who knows all about Ochberg orphans. He lives in Perth, did some research and worked out that that was his father, his real father. And cancelled the tickets to Singapore, heard about the reunion, came and was on the next plane to Israel and joined us. And he was the last person to relate this experience. And he said over there, I've now discovered who I am, who my father was, and the family of the Ochbergs. I want to end off by just relating to what the representative, firstly, of the JNF said at the time when we had the reunion in 2011. Avi Noam Binder, who was representing Kaplan and JNF. And he said, Isaac Ochberg was a dreamer who made dreams come true. When he purchased the land here, he's referring to Megiddo, scenery was nothing like what we see out today. The land was barren and desolate. Ochberg dreamt that the Jewish people would come here and establish a Jewish state. This project in his honor is to educate future generations of Israeli Jews not to take our many blessings for granted. Kakal JNF is honored to take part in this project in memory of a man who believed in the future of Israel. And then a week later, after people went home, I got this wonderful email from Isa and Henry Werb, who were part of the group that visited at the time. And you remember in the movie, you saw that we have a hill of names at the Ochberg Memorial there, where there are the plaques to all the 187 Ochberg orphans embedded into the rock. And Isa and Henry were summed up. They said the Ochberg experience in Israel was momentous. And they then go on and say, our 18-year-old granddaughter was with us, and I made her promise to come back to the forest with her own children one day, to honor those who now rest in peace in such a beautiful and tranquil place. I see the memorial as the hull of a ship with the names of the plaques as portholes, gazing on a wonderful vista. I know that the Ochberg children have finally all come home. The Megiddo Regional Council and the Mayor, Itzhak Holovsky, really welcome all of you. They look forward to welcome you when you visit Israel. Whenever you come to Israel, please let us know, and we'll take you and give you a guided tour of the site. You know, you heard in the second video clip the sad ending to Isaac Ochberg's life when his daughter Ruth died at the age of 16. And he then fell ill and died, a relatively young man at sea, and then was buried here in Cape Town. But if that is sad, I think we can take a lot of joy from the fact that his family today runs into the many, many thousands who refer to Isaac Ochberg as Daddy Ochberg, because there are these thousands of people all over the world. And I'm hoping that Isaac Ochberg from his celestial perch can be looking down and could be smiling, no longer at his children, but at his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, his great-great-grandchildren, for all eternity, because this family is going to grow and grow and grow, and his name will be forever enshrined and embedded at Megiddo. The area that was demarcated in Megiddo is known as Even Yitzchak, which was apparently his Hebrew name, and Even also means stone. And it's kind of like fitting that his name, like stone, is embedded into this area of Megiddo, which I think is one of the most beautiful areas in Israel today. So I look forward to all of you visiting Israel, visiting Megiddo, and walking there and giving you a tour of the area. All right, I'll end off over there and take questions. Stephen?
David, if I may speak, it's Brian speaking from Sydney. I did join your talk and thoroughly enjoyed it. I don't have any questions other than just to congratulate you on a great presentation.
I would just like to respond to Brian, because Brian will be shortly holding an exhibition, an Ochberg exhibition in Sydney, and we're working together on that. And all the best to you, Brian, and all the good work that you are in really spreading the legacy in Australia.
Thank you, David. Just by way of interest, I'm lying in a hospital bed. I've just had a minor heart attack, and I'm speaking from my hospital bed. But it was certainly worth joining you today.
Well, we wish you well and a speedy recovery, Brian, really.
Francine, do you have a question?
Yes.
Yes.
First of all, this is an inspirational and enlightening presentation. Thank you. But I do have a question. I was a little confused when you talked about the last man to speak at the dedication. It sounded like he discovered where he was from, but it sounded like he had been an orphan, that he didn't know his father. I was confused by that.
Arnold was an orphan had been adopted in Johannesburg by the Nadelman family, Arnold Nadelman. Am I right, Brian? Because I think you know him well, Arnold Nadelman. He knew he'd been adopted, but he didn't know who his real father was. So when he saw this photograph in the newspaper over there of this group of kids, it was an advert for our reunion that we had in 2011. And his wife pointed out that he looked like a kid of 3 years old in 1921, and that he looked like this kid. He then phoned up this fellow, David Sandler in Perth, who does research on Ochberg orphans, and they did some research, and they said, yes, that's your real father. So that's what actually happened.
I think, Artie, did you have a question? You'll need to unmute. There you go.
I wanted to commend you, Mr. Kaplan, for picking out this man from the 20s. And all I can assure you is that he is smiling from above. And all the Jews all over the world have to just say thank you for thinking of our race and keeping it going. And in the future, I'd like to have a meeting with you, Mr. Stephen Cohn. I have a few ideas about what I bring from New York City to the Show Me State. And I think it's all constructive. And with this young lady from Mirowitz, the last name is but I look forward to sharing some thoughts with you. And it's been a pleasure to hear Mr. Kaplan talk about a very proud Jewish man.
Thank you, David. So do we have some more questions today?
Maybe I could just add some more, if that's okay.
Sure.
You know, an operation like this doesn't just happen because of one man. I mean, one has to realize that you need the inspiration, and he gave it, and of course he went himself. But there were people along the way that did tremendous work. First, you had the community of South Africa, the Jewish community, had really galvanized to support this. But I would find it remiss not to mention of a particular man in Eastern Europe at the time, in Pinsk, called Alexander Bobrov, he was a chemist at the time, what they called an analytical chemist, who really helped organize getting the kids, the orphans, ready for Ochberg to come along, just to make it a little bit easier. And it's interesting because this man, his whole life changed, because having done that, he then accompanied Ochberg and the kids to South Africa and never went back to Eastern Europe. And what's interesting about Alexander Bobrov, he became the father-in-law of Sir Aaron Klug, who you might be familiar with, who won the 1982 Nobel laureate for chemistry. Originally, Stephen, you from Durban. He was originally from Durban. He was an Ashoma at Zaire, immigrated to the UK, became governor of the University of Enduring University of the Negev, won the Nobel Prize in 1982. But his father-in-law, Alexander Bobrov, was an incredible man who helped with the kids. And as he relates, I'm just going to give a quote of Alexander. So many children were found that we set up 3 orphanages in Pinsk. They were isolated by the fighting, that we were dependent solely on our own resources. We had neither beds, bedding, nor clothes. And I recall using flour bags to make clothes for the children. He then goes on to say how typhus broke out in one of the orphanages, and he relates how I had to walking through the streets as shells were exploding. What was interesting and quite touching, Bobrov, when he left, didn't want to tell his parents. You know, it's 1921, and he's leaving Eastern Europe for good. And so what did he do? He wrote a letter to his parents and put it under the tablecloth in the dining room, knowing that come Shabbat, his mother would change the tablecloth and put on the white tablecloth and find the letter explaining why he was doing what he was doing, this great mission. And that's what he did. He left this message explaining that he was joining Ochberg on this mission of saving all these children, because he was the favorite son, and he couldn't explain this to his parents at the time. The point is that he paid his parents back with dividends, because he went back and within a couple of years managed to save money and brought out his surviving mother and his sister and brought them to Cape Town, South Africa. So in that way, he saved them from what would have been what had happened with Hitler 20 years later. So that's the story of Alexander Bobrov. Any questions?
Dave, Francine asked another question in the chat. She would like to know, do you think that we can rent the movie?
Yeah, it's been shown on Israel TV, or has it been? No, it hasn't been shown. Let's discuss that, and we'll talk about it, how it can be done. There are 2 versions of the movie. There's a 38 and there's a 59-minute movie, 60 minutes. Let's call it 1 hour. Definitely best to watch the full 1 hour movie, because not only does it give the stories of the Ochberg orphans and about Isaac and interviews, etc., but it gives you the whole vibe, what it was like in Eastern Europe at the time. And there are beautiful sequences in the movie. I'll just give it one example. Look, also for the movie, we were indebted to Lawrence Snetcher. Lawrence Snetcher from Cape Town, whose grandmother, which she calls Oma, was an Ochberg orphan. She was the one who really interviewed a lot of these orphans before they died, and that became part of the resource for the actual movie. And there are sequences in the movie, and they're quite interesting, where you see, like, I found it at first kind of disturbing, where you see like snowflakes in between sequences in the movie. And I wondered what it was. And I asked Laura, because I thought that possibly it was snowflakes, because it was so cold and so freezing. And one of the orphans just showed us his shows you his ear had chipped away from the cold. He was only 5 or 6 at the time. So I thought it was to really get the atmospherics of freezing cold. And she said, no, it's fluff and feathers. And why? Because her granny, I think her name was Gesundman, had this recurring nightmare because of feathers. And what were the feathers? When the Cossacks used to come into the town and the shtetls, brandishing their sabres, they used to go for the bedding. They used to go for the mattresses and the pillows, because that's where they thought the Jews were hiding the gold and the diamonds and the money. So they used to come in and used to just rip the bedding looking for gold diamonds before killing the people. And you'd have all these feathers. So those were, it was kind of like sequences in the movie, which gives it the atmospherics. In fact, I have a sequence about one of the pogroms about this. Let me see if I can find it.
While you're looking for that, Dave, I wonder if maybe afterwards you could, if you have some resource or place that someone could find the movie if they wanted to see it, maybe you could send that to me and I could forward that on to the participants.
Okay, we'll discuss that.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, I mean, Ochberg left in 1921. In 1990, it was one of the most bloodiest pogroms, which was the Prozorov massacre in 1990. And it was at the time of the Ukrainian leader, Simon Petlura. And they came into this town, 1,600 Jews were killed in one day in 3 hours. And one related how they came into the house, took out the sword and quote, "We're going to cut off your heads," and asked for gold and diamonds. Fortunately, a bugle for retreat sounded, and that is how they survived. Their neighbors were not so lucky. But that reminded me, this little story about the fluff, because they would have cut open all the bedding. Now,
David?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, this is Brian speaking. If they want some resources, they could visit the website, which is isaacochberg.org. They may be able to see the passports and quite a few other things there.
Right.
Okay.
Judith?
Yeah. Yes.
Maybe just show them, we didn't show all the photographs, show them the photograph there at the end there with the people in 2011 are viewing the Hill of Names and looking at the plaques.
Okay. Let me get that back up. Hold on one second. The one with them looking at the hill?
Yes.
Okay.
There, you can see it. There, you can see people looking, and then on the right, you can see embedded are the names of the Ochberg orphans, details about them, which town or shtetl they came from, their family name, and so on. And it's a serpentine path, and we don't call it a wall of names and we call it a hill of names. And we're in the process of expanding this park. It's a 5 square kilometer park. We're going to be developing it. We'd like to see it as a diaspora park where other Jewish communities can participate with their stories, with their narratives. And the moment we have the section, which is the South African section, where we dedicate to Isaac Ochberg, his name is so embedded in the whole narrative of Megiddo. But there you get an idea. We're going to hopefully be constructing a promenade and so on and so forth, and an information center.
That sounds wonderful. That sounds so wonderful. And maybe once we can all start traveling again,
absolutely,
could possibly get to visit. Stephen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
We could sit here for a lot longer listening to you, but
I mean,
very generous with your time. And the people who joined us have also been generous with theirs. I want to thank Brian Fine for joining us from Australia. Mr. Weiss, please be in touch with Susan and myself about your ideas. And thank you, Eliad, for joining us as well. David, thank you so much for this inspiring and really very moving presentation and this incredible story about a remarkable man. And to you and Eliad, as they do in Israel always, on a Thursday evening, we wish you a Shabbat Shalom. And thank you. Thank you for
Shabbat Shalom. And really, and a literal from all the team in Megiddo, the Moatzah, the mayor, Ruth Wasserman, who would like to have joined us, but she's now Chavrei Knesset. She's in the new coalition government. She's now public relations, and we work very, strongly with her. So a lot of people, and they all wish you well and Shabbat Shalom, and look forward to welcoming you in Israel. Thank you.
Thank you again.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for coming today. Bye-bye, Dave. Thank you so much.